Welcome to Reddit Trends, where I share interesting, useful, and inspiring content. Let's explore the world through the videos I create. Sometimes life brings unexpected turns that no one could have predicted. Imagine a humble, hardworking woman spending her days cleaning, enduring the scorn and mockery of her colleagues. But then, in a stunning twist, she completely changes the game, even going so far as to personally fire the most powerful boss in the company. What happened? What secrets were hidden beneath the dust of the working class? You won't want to miss this shocking and inspiring moment. Don't forget to hit the follow button so you won't miss out on anything new. Thank you for visiting, and I hope we have amazing experiences together. Claire Dawson moved through the gleaming, high-rise corridors of Griffin Enterprises, her faded blue uniform blending into the background. As the clamor of phones ringing, executives barking orders, and heels clicking against polished floors echoed around her, Claire remained unnoticed, her worn hands gripping the cleaning cart. She was the quiet observer in a bustling world of power and wealth. To the employees of Griffin Enterprises, Claire was invisible, a fixture in the building, like the potted plants or the artwork on the walls. But she had watched, and she had learned. It had been over a decade since Claire first started working at Griffin Enterprises. Day after day, she meticulously cleaned offices, boardrooms, and break rooms, her presence ignored by those who considered her beneath their notice. Yet, despite the constant dismissiveness, Claire maintained a quiet dignity. She knew more about the company than anyone could ever imagine. She saw the true faces behind the corporate masks, and she was privy to secrets hidden behind closed doors. No one knew the extent of her knowledge. They never bothered to ask. One afternoon, as Claire scrubbed the mahogany table in the executive boardroom, the door swung open. Evan Wells, one of the senior managers, strutted in, his expensive suit sharp and his confidence radiating arrogance. He glanced at Claire with disdain, not bothering to hide his contempt. "Make sure that table is spotless, Dawson. The CEO's flying in from LA for the big meeting. We wouldn't want to disappoint him, would we?" His voice dripped with condescension, and a smirk played on his lips. The other managers chuckled as they entered behind him, exchanging knowing glances. Claire looked up briefly but said nothing, her hands continuing their work. She knew Evan's type all too well, men who wielded power like a weapon, using it to belittle those they saw as beneath them. Evan was known for his sharp tongue and dismissive attitude toward anyone not in his elite circle. Claire had watched him for years, taking note of every demeaning comment, every unethical decision, and every moment of careless superiority. As the boardroom emptied, leaving Claire alone again, she paused, her eyes lingering on the view of New York City sprawled out beneath her. From up here, in the towering headquarters of Griffin Enterprises, the city seemed small, insignificant, just like the way she was seen by the company's higher-ups. But Claire knew better. She had spent years gathering information, quietly positioning herself for what was to come. In another part of the building, Lauren Hayes, a recent hire fresh out of business school, felt the weight of her new job. Griffin Enterprises was a prestigious name, but the corporate culture was toxic. From the moment she stepped through the door, Lauren had felt the underlying tension, the backstabbing, the arrogance, the disdain for anyone who wasn't part of the inner circle. She had met Claire Dawson early on, during her first week, and something about the cleaner's calm, steady demeanor had stood out to her. Claire didn't fit the mold of the downtrodden worker who had accepted her place. No, there was something quietly powerful about her, something Lauren couldn't quite put her finger on. That afternoon, as Lauren passed by the boardroom, she noticed Claire cleaning up after the meeting preparations. She paused at the door, watching for a moment. Claire's movements were methodical, precise. Lauren had always been good at reading people, and Claire's calmness struck her as unusual in such a high-pressure environment. There was something beneath the surface, an awareness, a sense of control that didn't match her position as a cleaner. "Hi, Claire," Lauren greeted as she stepped into the room, her voice gentle but curious. Claire looked up, giving Lauren a small smile. "Afternoon, Ms. Hayes. How are you settling in?" Lauren shrugged, glancing around the room. "It's different than I expected. People here, they seem Cold, I guess. Claire nodded knowingly. It's a different world, that's for sure. But you'll find your way. I hope so, Lauren replied, then hesitated before adding, it feels like something big is coming. I don't know what, but there's a shift in the air. Claire's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in her eyes. You have good instincts, Ms. Hayes. Trust them. With that, Lauren nodded and left the room, her mind buzzing with curiosity. There was more to Claire Dawson than met the eye. The next day was a flurry of activity at Griffin Enterprises. The CEO, Richard Mason, was arriving for the company's annual review meeting, and the senior managers were on edge. Reports were being finalized, presentations rehearsed, and tensions were high. Claire moved through it all, unseen as usual, but her presence in the boardroom was deliberate. She knew this day was significant. She had waited for this moment for years. As the senior managers gathered around the table, Evan Wells stood at the head, ready to present his quarterly report. His smirk was firmly in place, his arrogance on full display. Claire continued her work silently, unnoticed in the corner of the room. Suddenly, the door opened, and Richard Mason, the enigmatic CEO of Griffin Enterprises, walked in. He was a man of few words, but his presence commanded attention. The room fell silent as he took his seat, his eyes scanning the room. Then, to the shock of everyone present, Richard's gaze settled on Claire. Ms. Dawson, he said, his voice cutting through the silence, thank you for joining us. Evan's smirk faltered, confusion flickering across his face. He exchanged bewildered glances with the other managers. Why was the CEO addressing the cleaner? Claire, for the first time, stepped forward. Thank you, Mr. Mason, she replied, her voice calm but firm. She moved to stand at the head of the table, opposite Evan, who now looked visibly uncomfortable. Richard Mason leaned back in his chair, a slight smile playing on his lips. As most of you may not know, he began, Ms. Claire Dawson is not just an employee at Griffin Enterprises. She is, in fact, the majority shareholder of this company. The room erupted into gasps and murmurs. Evan's face turned pale as he stared at Claire in disbelief. Claire straightened her shoulders, meeting the eyes of every manager in the room. For years, I've watched this company operate. I've seen the way people are treated, the culture of arrogance and disrespect that festers here. That ends today. The managers sat in stunned silence, too shocked to speak. Claire continued, her voice unwavering. Effective immediately, there will be changes, starting with you, Mr. Wells. Evan's face twisted with disbelief. You can't fire me, he sputtered. Claire's gaze remained steady. Actually, I can. And I just did. The power dynamics in the room shifted in an instant. Claire Dawson, the invisible cleaner, had become the most powerful person in the company, and the future of Griffin Enterprises was now in her hands. Evan Wells stormed out of the boardroom, disbelief still etched on his face as the news of his dismissal sank in. Claire Dawson remained calm, standing at the head of the table where she had once quietly cleaned. The managers in the room were still processing the dramatic shift in power, their eyes darting between Claire and Richard Mason, the CEO who had just unveiled the shocking truth. The atmosphere in the room was tense, the once confident managers now grappling with the realization that the woman they had dismissed for years was now in control. Claire, however, remained focused. She had spent years preparing for this moment, quietly buying up shares, learning the ins and outs of the business, and observing every detail. She was ready to take the next step. Lauren Hayes, the new hire who had sensed something different about Claire, watched from her seat near the back of the room. Her intuition had been right, there was more to Claire than anyone had ever realized. Lauren's thoughts raced as she reflected on her own experiences at Griffin Enterprises. She had felt out of place from the start, uncomfortable with the arrogant and cutthroat culture that seemed to thrive among the senior managers. But now, with Claire in charge, everything could change. After Evan's abrupt exit, Richard Mason addressed the room again. I suggest you all take some time to process the news, he said, his tone measured but firm. There will be a formal meeting tomorrow to discuss the restructuring. In the meantime, I trust you will show Ms. Dawson the respect she deserves." With that, the CEO stood, nodded to Claire, and left the room. The managers, still in shock, began to file out one by one, casting uneasy glances at Claire. Lauren hesitated for a moment, then stood and approached the woman who had just upended the power dynamics of the entire company. "Ms. Dawson," Lauren began, her voice steady but filled with curiosity, "I had a feeling there was more to you than people realized. But this is incredible." Claire turned to Lauren, her expression softening slightly. "I appreciate that, Ms. Hayes. I've been waiting a long time for this moment. And now, it's time for change." Lauren nodded, sensing the weight behind Claire's words. She had only been at Griffin Enterprises for a few months, but in that short time, she had seen the toxic behavior that permeated the corporate culture. She had watched as people like Evan Wells used their positions of power to belittle others, making it clear that only those at the top were valued. The idea that Claire, a woman who had been dismissed by everyone, was now in control filled her with a sense of hope. "Do you really think you can change things here?" Lauren asked, her voice betraying a hint of skepticism. Claire's gaze was steady, her eyes filled with quiet determination. "I've spent years watching this company, Ms. Hayes. I know how it operates, and I know where the rot is. It won't be easy, but I'm not afraid of hard work. The old way of doing things is over. From now on, this company will be built on respect and collaboration, not arrogance and intimidation." Lauren could feel the sincerity in Claire's words, and something inside her shifted. For the first time since joining Griffin Enterprises, she felt a spark of optimism. Maybe, under Claire's leadership, things really could be different. "I'd like to help," Lauren said, surprising herself with her own boldness. Claire raised an eyebrow, studying Lauren for a moment before nodding. "I think you and I will work well together, Ms. Hayes. If you find it interesting, please like it. If not, please comment number 1. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this video." With that, the two women exchanged a look of mutual understanding. Lauren knew that the road ahead would be difficult, but she was willing to take on the challenge. Together, they could transform Griffin Enterprises into something better. As the day wore on, word of the dramatic boardroom revelation spread throughout the company. Employees whispered in the hallways, speculating about Claire Dawson's sudden rise to power and what it meant for the future. Some were skeptical, believing that someone with no formal corporate experience couldn't possibly lead such a prestigious company. Others, particularly those who had been marginalized by the previous leadership, felt a glimmer of hope. Perhaps, under Claire's leadership, things would finally change for the better. Meanwhile, Evan Wells fumed in his office, packing up his things with shaking hands. He couldn't believe what had just happened. For years, he had been untouchable, rising through the ranks with ease and enjoying the perks of his position. Now, he had been humiliated in front of his colleagues, fired by a woman he had considered invisible. His mind raced as he tried to figure out his next move. Surely, there had to be some way to reverse this, some loophole he could exploit to regain his position. But deep down, he knew that Claire Dawson was no fool. She had played the long game, and she had won. Back in the boardroom, Claire and Lauren sat down to discuss the future of the company. Claire's demeanor remained calm, but there was a fire in her eyes that Lauren hadn't seen before. This was a woman who had been waiting for her moment, and now that it had arrived, she wasn't going to waste it. "We need to start with the culture," Claire said, her voice firm. "For too long, this company has been run by people like Evan Wells, people who believe that power means treating others like they're disposable. That ends now. We need to build a culture of respect, where every employee feels valued and heard." Lauren nodded, her mind racing with ideas. "We could start with an internal review, assessing how different departments are functioning and identifying key areas where improvement is needed. And we'll need to address the management structure. There are plenty of people who have been passed over for promotions because they didn't fit the elite mold." Claire smiled. "Exactly. We need to find the people who have been overlooked and give them the opportunities they deserve. And we need to make it clear that the days of favoritism and arrogance are over. As the conversation continued, Claire and Lauren began outlining their plan for the future of Griffin Enterprises. It would take time, and there would be resistance, but they were both determined to see it through. Together, they would reshape the company, creating a place where talent, hard work, and respect were valued above all else. By the time the sun set over the Manhattan skyline, Claire and Lauren had laid the groundwork for the transformation of Griffin Enterprises. Claire's long journey from the shadows to the forefront of the company was just beginning, and she was ready for the challenges that lay ahead. In the distance, the city buzzed with life, unaware of the changes unfolding within Griffin Enterprises. But soon enough, everyone would know. Claire Dawson was no longer invisible. She was in charge, and nothing would ever be the same again. The day of the annual review meeting had arrived, and the atmosphere at Griffin Enterprises was electric with anticipation. The senior managers, dressed in their finest suits, gathered in the large, modern boardroom, where the city skyline stretched out beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. They were anxious, some checking their notes, others rehearsing their reports under their breath. This meeting was crucial. The CEO, Richard Mason, had flown in from Los Angeles to hear their presentations, and everyone knew how high the stakes were. But despite the tension in the air, Claire Dawson moved through the room with her usual calmness. She cleaned the last traces of dust from the glass conference table, her movements smooth and efficient. The senior managers, as always, ignored her presence. She had become a part of the scenery, a silent figure who blended into the background, as invisible as ever. Evan Wells, however, was far from calm. He strutted around the room with the kind of arrogance that had come to define him, checking every detail. He was the senior manager, and this was his moment to shine. His report was impeccable, his presentation polished, and he was ready to impress Richard Mason. As he passed Claire, he threw her a dismissive glance. "Make sure it's spotless, Dawson," he sneered, loud enough for the others to hear. A few of his colleagues chuckled, as if mocking the cleaner added to Evan's already inflated sense of superiority. Claire, as usual, said nothing. She simply continued her work, her face expressionless. But deep inside, she knew that this day would change everything. At exactly noon, the door to the boardroom opened, and Richard Mason walked in. The room fell silent. The CEO was a man of few words but immense presence. His sharp eyes scanned the room, taking in every detail before he settled into the leather chair at the head of the table. The senior managers shuffled nervously in their seats, waiting for the meeting to begin. Evan cleared his throat and stood up, his chest puffed out with confidence. "Mr. Mason, we've prepared a comprehensive report on the company's performance over the last quarter," he began, launching into his well-rehearsed presentation. His voice was smooth, self-assured, and he made sure to emphasize the success of his own team. As Evan spoke, Claire remained by the wall, seemingly invisible. But her mind was alert, watching every reaction, every glance exchanged between the executives. She had been waiting for this moment for years, quietly observing, gathering information, and now it was time for her to step into the light. As Evan continued to drone on, Richard Mason raised his hand, signaling for him to stop. "Thank you, Evan," Richard said, his tone even but firm. "But before we go any further, there's someone else I need to hear from today." The senior managers exchanged confused glances. This wasn't part of the usual protocol. Evan's smirk faltered slightly, but he quickly recovered, assuming that perhaps Richard was referring to one of the other executives. To everyone's shock, Richard turned his gaze to Claire. "Ms. Dawson," he said, addressing her directly for the first time in front of the entire senior management team. "Would you join us at the table, please?" The room went dead silent. Evan's eyes widened in disbelief, and several of the other managers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Claire Dawson? The cleaner? What was happening? Claire calmly put down her cleaning supplies and walked toward the table, her steps measured and deliberate. She took the seat directly across from Evan, who looked like he had just swallowed something bitter. Richard Mason leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled as he looked around the room. I'm sure many of you are wondering why Ms. Dawson is sitting at this table. Allow me to explain. The tension in the room was palpable. No one dared to speak. Claire Dawson has been with Griffin Enterprises for over a decade, Richard began. During that time, she has seen every corner of this company, observed its operations, and learned more about its inner workings than most of you sitting here today. Evan's face twisted with confusion and indignation. But she's just a cleaner, he blurted out, unable to contain himself. What could she possibly? Richard raised a hand, silencing Evan. Ms. Dawson is not just a cleaner, he said, his voice cool. She is, in fact, the majority shareholder of Griffin Enterprises. The room exploded into murmurs of disbelief. Claire Dawson, the woman who had scrubbed their floors and cleaned their offices, owned the majority of the company? How was that even possible? Evan's face turned white as a sheet. This is a joke, right? He stammered, looking around for support. She can't be. But Richard Mason wasn't finished. Over the years, Ms. Dawson has quietly acquired shares of Griffin Enterprises, one at a time. She's been patient, strategic, and above all, determined. Today, she holds the majority of the company's stock. And as of now, she has full authority over its direction. Evan's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, struggling to comprehend the words. The other managers sat frozen in their seats, too stunned to react. Claire Dawson, the woman they had all ignored for years, now held more power than any of them. Claire, for her part, remained composed. She looked directly at Evan, her eyes calm but filled with the weight of everything she had endured. Mr. Wells, she said, her voice steady but resolute, I've watched you treat people with disrespect for far too long. Your arrogance and your disregard for others have no place in the future of this company. Evan's face flushed red. You can't just. I can, Claire interrupted, her voice firm. And I am. Effective immediately, you are no longer employed by Griffin Enterprises. The room was silent once again, the only sound the ticking of the large wall clock. Evan sat in stunned silence, his hands trembling slightly as the realization sank in. He had been fired, by Claire Dawson, of all people. Richard Mason stood, signaling the end of the meeting. I suggest the rest of you take some time to reflect on what's happened here today, he said, his voice calm but authoritative. There will be a formal meeting tomorrow to discuss the changes Ms. Dawson will be implementing. I expect all of you to be prepared. With that, the CEO nodded to Claire and left the room, leaving the senior managers to process the seismic shift that had just occurred. Claire rose from her seat, the weight of the moment settling over her like a cloak. She had finally stepped out of the shadows, and now, Griffin Enterprises was hers to reshape. The journey ahead would be difficult, but she was ready for the challenge. For years, she had been invisible, but now, everyone in the room knew exactly who Claire Dawson was, and no one would ever overlook her again. As the door closed behind Richard Mason, the remaining managers sat in stunned silence, struggling to process what had just transpired. Claire Dawson, the woman who had been invisible to them for years, now stood as the most powerful person in the room. The air was thick with disbelief, and no one dared to speak. Claire stood, her presence now commanding the attention of everyone. She gazed around the room, her eyes calm yet determined. This was the moment she had prepared for, the moment she had waited for 3 years of quiet observation and careful planning. Without hesitation, she addressed the room. I'm sure today has been a surprise for all of you, she began, her voice steady. But let me assure you, change is coming to Griffin Enterprises. The days of toxic behavior, favoritism, and arrogance are over. The managers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, realizing that their usual tactics of intimidation and control would no longer be tolerated. Evan Wells, once the most confident and arrogant among them, sat in his chair, still pale and speechless. The shock of his firing had yet to fully sink in. Claire turned her gaze directly toward him. Mr. Wells, as I mentioned earlier, your employment with Griffin Enterprises is terminated effective immediately. You are no longer welcome in this company, and I expect you to vacate your office by the end of the day. Evan finally found his voice, though it came out shaky and weak. "You can't just fire me like that. I've been with this company for years. I've made sacrifices, I've brought in major clients." Claire's expression remained unchanged. "You've brought in clients by stepping on those beneath you, by fostering a culture of fear and disrespect. That is not how this company will operate moving forward." Evan opened his mouth to protest again, but no words came out. He knew, deep down, that there was no point in arguing. Claire had the authority now, and there was nothing he could do to change that. Defeated, he stood, his face a mix of anger and humiliation. Without another word, he left the boardroom, the door closing behind him with a final, echoing thud. The tension in the room eased slightly with Evan's departure, but the other managers still looked uneasy. They had worked alongside Evan for years, many of them adopting similar attitudes of arrogance and superiority. Now, with Claire in charge, they were all wondering what their own futures held. Claire remained standing at the head of the table, her posture strong and confident. "For those of you still here, let me make this clear," she said, her voice calm but resolute. "I will not tolerate the toxic culture that has taken root in this company. If you are willing to adapt, if you are willing to treat others with respect and fairness, then you will have a place at Griffin Enterprises. If not, you will need to find work elsewhere." A few of the managers exchanged nervous glances, but no one spoke up. They knew that Claire wasn't bluffing. She had taken control of the company with quiet determination, and she wouldn't hesitate to make further changes if necessary. One of the senior managers, a man named Greg, finally cleared his throat. "Ms. Dawson," he began cautiously, "what exactly are your plans for the company moving forward?" Claire nodded, as if anticipating the question. "My first priority is to rebuild the culture of this company. We need to foster an environment where every employee feels valued and respected, regardless of their position. We will be conducting an internal review to identify areas where improvement is needed, and I expect full cooperation from everyone in this room." Greg nodded slowly, clearly still processing everything. "And the leadership structure? Will there be changes?" Claire met his gaze directly. "Yes. There will be changes. I will be evaluating the current leadership and making decisions based on merit, not favoritism. Those who have been overlooked for promotions because they didn't fit the elite mold will be given the opportunities they deserve." Lauren Hayes, who had been sitting quietly at the back of the room, felt a surge of hope at Claire's words. She had witnessed firsthand how the company's leadership had been dominated by arrogance and cronyism. Now, with Claire at the helm, there was a chance for real change. A chance for those who had been marginalized to finally be recognized for their hard work and talent. After a moment of silence, Claire continued. "I also want to make it clear that Griffin Enterprises will no longer be a place where people rise to the top by stepping on others. Collaboration, respect, and integrity will be the core values of this company moving forward. Anyone who cannot embrace these values will be asked to leave." The managers, now fully understanding the gravity of the situation, nodded in agreement, though some still looked uneasy. They had been part of a system that rewarded cutthroat behavior, and now that system was being dismantled right before their eyes. Lauren watched Claire with a mix of admiration and awe. Claire's calm, measured approach had completely shifted the dynamics of the company in a single day. And yet, there was no gloating, no self-righteousness in her demeanor. Claire had stepped into her role as leader with grace and determination, and it was clear that she was focused on the future of the company rather than settling scores from the past. As the meeting wrapped up, Claire made one final statement. "I know this is a lot to take in, and I understand that change is never easy. But I believe in this company, and I believe in the potential of the people who work here. Together, we can make Griffin Enterprises a place where everyone has the opportunity to succeed." With that, Claire gathered her notes and left the boardroom, leaving the remaining managers to reflect on what had just transpired. Some looked relieved, others concerned, but one thing was certain, things at Griffin Enterprises would never be the same again. As Claire walked through the hallways of the company she now controlled, she felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. For years, she had been invisible, watching as people like Evan Wells wielded power without accountability. But now, the tables had turned. She had the authority to make real, lasting change, and she was determined to do just that. Lauren caught up with her in the hallway, a mixture of admiration and curiosity on her face. "Ms. Dawson," she began, "that was incredible. I don't think anyone saw that coming." Claire smiled slightly. Sometimes the best moves are the ones no one expects. Lauren nodded, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. "I'm ready to help with whatever you need. This company needs a fresh start, and I want to be a part of that." Claire paused for a moment, considering Lauren's words. "I think you'll be a valuable part of what's to come, Lauren. We have a lot of work ahead of us, but together, I believe we can make Griffin Enterprises a place worth working for." With that, the two women continued down the hallway, side by side, ready to take on the challenges that lay ahead. The future of Griffin Enterprises was uncertain, but one thing was clear: under Claire Dawson's leadership, it was going to be a very different company. Claire Dawson stood at the front of Griffin Enterprises' sleek boardroom, the city skyline glowing in the distance as evening settled over New York. The once bustling office had quieted, with most employees gone for the day. Claire, however, remained focused on the work ahead. Today had marked a turning point, both for the company and for herself. For years, she had walked these halls as an invisible figure, ignored and underestimated by the very people she now led. Now, she was in control, and it was time to shape the future of Griffin Enterprises. Lauren Hayes stood beside Claire, her eyes filled with admiration and excitement. The events of the day had left a lasting impression on her. From the moment Richard Mason revealed that Claire was the majority shareholder, to Evan Wells' dramatic firing, everything had changed. The air in the office seemed different now. There was a sense of possibility, of transformation. "Do you think they'll actually change?" Lauren asked, breaking the silence. She was referring to the senior managers who had spent years perpetuating the toxic culture that Claire had vowed to dismantle. Claire glanced at her, her expression thoughtful. "Some of them will," she replied. "But others, well, not everyone can adapt to change. Those who can't will have to find a different path." Lauren nodded, understanding the unspoken message. Claire wasn't going to compromise her vision for the future of the company, no matter how uncomfortable that might be for those accustomed to the old ways. It was a bold approach, but one that Lauren respected deeply. She had seen the worst of corporate culture during her brief time at Griffin Enterprises, and the thought of a more collaborative, respectful environment filled her with hope. As they walked through the quiet office, Claire reflected on the years that had led her to this moment. It hadn't been easy, working tirelessly as a cleaner while quietly amassing shares of the company, all the while observing the behavior of those in power. She had seen the greed, the arrogance, the way people like Evan Wells dismissed others simply because they held less prestigious titles. But she had also seen potential, people like Lauren, who hadn't been corrupted by the toxic culture and who genuinely wanted to make a difference. "I didn't get here alone," Claire said, her voice softer now as they reached her office. "There were people who believed in me, even when I was just the cleaner. They helped me see the bigger picture, helped me understand how this company works." Lauren looked at her curiously. "Who are they?" Claire smiled, a small, almost secretive smile. "You'll meet some of them soon enough. They're the ones who helped me build my shareholdings, piece by piece. They saw something in me that the others didn't." Lauren felt a flicker of curiosity, wondering who these mysterious allies were. But she didn't press for more information. She had a feeling Claire would reveal more in time. As they sat in Claire's new office, Lauren couldn't help but admire how Claire seemed completely at ease in her new role. It was as if she had always belonged at the head of the company. Yet, there was no arrogance in her demeanor, only quiet determination and a clear vision for the future. "I've been thinking about our next steps," Claire said, her voice becoming more businesslike. "We need to conduct a full audit of the company's internal practices. I want to know exactly how things have been run, and where the problems lie." Lauren nodded eagerly. "I can help with that. We can start by interviewing employees across all departments, see where the gaps are and how we can address them. Claire smiled, appreciating Lauren's initiative. That's exactly what I had in mind. I want to hear from everyone, from the junior staff to the executives. We need to rebuild trust from the ground up. Lauren felt a surge of excitement. This was what she had hoped for when she first joined Griffin Enterprises, a chance to make a real difference. With Claire leading the charge, it felt like anything was possible. As they discussed plans for the company's future, the sense of optimism between them grew. Claire was determined to create a culture of respect, collaboration, and fairness, and Lauren was eager to help her make that vision a reality. But Claire also knew that not everyone would welcome the changes. Some of the senior managers were deeply entrenched in their ways, and she expected resistance. That was fine. She was prepared for it. Claire had spent too many years watching from the sidelines, learning how power worked in the corporate world. She knew that real change didn't happen overnight, and she was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. In the days that followed, Claire wasted no time in implementing her plans. The first order of business was the internal audit, which revealed some glaring issues in the company's management practices. Employees who had been overlooked for promotions due to favoritism, departments where bullying and intimidation had been allowed to thrive, Claire tackled each problem head-on, making it clear that things were going to change. Evan Wells' departure sent a powerful message. His colleagues, who had once been untouchable in their arrogance, now found themselves under close scrutiny. Some left the company voluntarily, unwilling to adjust to the new culture Claire was building. Others stayed, recognizing that Claire's vision was not only the right path forward but one that could ultimately lead to greater success for Griffin Enterprises. Lauren, meanwhile, found herself thriving under Claire's leadership. She became one of Claire's closest advisors, working tirelessly to help implement the changes they had discussed. Together, they began transforming Griffin Enterprises into a place where employees felt valued and respected, where collaboration was encouraged, and where success wasn't measured solely by profits but by the well-being of everyone in the company. The changes didn't happen overnight, but slowly, the company began to shift. Employees who had once felt invisible, like Claire herself had, were given opportunities to shine. The new culture attracted fresh talent, people who were drawn to the idea of working for a company that prioritized respect and integrity. Griffin Enterprises became a model of how corporate culture could be transformed from within, and Claire's story of rising from a cleaner to the majority shareholder became an inspiration to many. As the months passed, Claire reflected on her journey with quiet pride. She had come a long way from the invisible cleaner pushing a mop through the hallways. But she never lost sight of where she had come from or the values that had driven her to this point. Claire Dawson was no longer the invisible woman at Griffin Enterprises. She was its leader, and under her guidance, the company was moving toward a brighter, more inclusive future. Thank you for reading this story. See you in a new and better story.